Our region is facing a critical environmental challenge. We can't see ozone, but we can feel its effects. Ozone affects all of us living, breathing, and working in the Maricopa region. And as you will see in this presentation, it also has an impact on the economy and transportation for the entire state of Arizona. Let's start with the bottom line. First, a large portion of the Maricopa Association of Governments planning area, which includes Maricopa County and portions of Pinal County, has been classified in the moderate category for ozone. If nothing changes, it is extremely likely that we will be reclassified to serious nonattainment in late 2024. Why is this important? Ozone is foremost a public health concern, affecting residents' lungs and immune systems. MAG recognizes its responsibility in protecting public health. It is also important to note that through cooperative efforts by the state, Maricopa County, MAG, and our member cities, towns, and native nations, air quality in the region has improved over the last 20 years, even with a growing population and significantly more transportation activity. In fact, roads, streets, and transit projects in the Regional Transportation Plan adopted in 2004, known as Proposition 400, and the projects in the Proposition 400 extension, currently proposed, are critical to address ozone. But increasingly tight standards mean that even with the 20-year improvement in air quality, we still have more work to do. Finally, due to federal air quality laws and regulations, we must further reduce ozone in our region. These reduction measures are challenging and in some cases can cost a lot of money. However, the cost of doing nothing could be even more significant to our economy. In fact, if we do nothing, we risk handing the control of our air quality planning to the Environmental Protection Agency's regional office in San Francisco. MAG takes its role as the lead air quality planning agency for the Phoenix Mesa metropolitan region very seriously, but other agencies also play important roles. Ozone standards come from the Federal Clean Air Act, passed in the early 1970s. Its most recent revisions were done more than 30 years ago in 1990. The purpose of the act is to set a public health standard for clean air. Regulations for the Clean Air Act are under the authority of the Federal Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA. MAG's responsibility comes from federal law and the regulations issued by EPA. MAG's responsibility for air quality planning goes hand in hand with our job of transportation planning. Air quality and transportation are tightly linked, given that vehicles are the biggest local contributor to air pollution. MAG is responsible for creating the air quality plans that demonstrate conformity with the EPA's regulations under the Clean Air Act. The word conformity is a specific term for both air quality and transportation. If we do not develop a plan of reasonable measures to conform to ozone standards, the EPA will step in and do it for us. It is also important to know that while MAG is responsible for air quality plans, it has no enforcement powers or authority to pass laws or rules. Those regulations can only come from the state of Arizona, Maricopa County, or local cities, towns, or native nations. Together, we form the network of agencies charged with planning, reporting, and complying with the federal regulations. The area in blue is the MAG planning boundary. The dark purple represents the nonattainment boundary, or the area not meeting the federal health standard for ozone. The nonattainment boundary encompasses the vast majority of the MAG planning area, and it's about the size of Connecticut. That means we need to address ozone on a significantly larger scale than most areas across the U.S. Ozone is a secondary pollutant and doesn't form directly from an emission source. Ozone needs to have a few ingredients to form. First are volatile organic compounds that come from sources like plants, painting, solvents, and wildfires. The second is oxides of nitrogen, or NOx, that come from the burning of fossil fuels. The main sources of NOx include heavy-duty trucks, cars, and industrial facilities. Those chemicals have to react in the presence of sunlight, which we get plenty of here in the region, to produce ozone. Ozone can pose a public health risk for all residents, but especially children and those with existing health issues. Ozone impacts the lungs by making it more difficult to breathe deeply. It aggravates pre-existing conditions like asthma, emphysema, and chronic bronchitis. It can cause burning and watery eyes, sore throat, and coughing. Ozone also inflames the airways and makes the lungs more susceptible to infection, which is particularly an issue today with new emerging diseases like COVID that directly impact the respiratory system. When an area does not meet the federal ozone standard, the EPA will classify the area in specific categories, which we'll discuss in more detail shortly. Currently, our region is categorized as moderate nonattainment for the 70 parts per billion standard. This means our air has more ozone on average than the allowable standard and has done so for a period of time. In 2021, our region had an ozone value of 80 parts per billion, mainly due to wildfires. MAG is allowed to exclude days when an area was impacted by wildfires. That brings down the value to 75 parts per billion. In 2022, the ozone value was 81 parts per billion with wildfires and 77 parts per billion once wildfires were excluded from the planning process. Those exclusions are referred to as exceptional events, and while we are allowed to remove those days for planning purposes, we are still exposed to high levels of ozone during those wildfire events. In other words, that higher value is the air we're breathing, which is why decreasing ozone for health reasons is so important. As noted earlier, when an area does not meet the federal ozone standard, the EPA classifies the area in different categories. The best category for human health and our economy is attainment. However, when we are not in attainment, we typically start off in the marginal classification, and we get 3 years to attain the standard. The area also must implement a new air quality permitting program that requires emission offsets for large new and expanding businesses. If we don't meet the standard, then we are recategorized to the next more stringent regulatory classification of moderate, which is where we are today. At this point, significant regulatory programs are required to reduce ozone concentrations, and the amount of emission offsets increases for large, new, and expanding businesses. Again, the area has another 3 years to meet the standard. For our region, this deadline is 2024. The next level is a major breakpoint in the severity of regulatory programs, and the emission offset threshold gets cut in half. This will have a serious impact on our region's economy if we do not take steps to decrease ozone concentrations as soon as possible. From there, the programs only get more stringent, and the emission offsets continue to increase. As you can see from the graph, ozone standards change over time and have only been getting more stringent. The ozone standard review is required by the Clean Air Act in that every 5 years the EPA must review the standard to determine if a change needs to occur. Our region was trending in the right direction through 2018, but as you can see from the dark blue line, ozone has increased in the past few years. The blue line also represents the air we breathe, including air quality impacted by wildfires. The green line represents the ozone levels when wildfires are removed. Even with those days removed, however, we are still 7 parts per billion from meeting the standard. The reality is that we have a very large ozone challenge we must address, and we need to do it quickly. The ozone issue is not just an urban core issue. This map represents the air quality monitors in the region. The vast majority of monitors in the region measure ozone levels above the federal standard. So what have we done to reduce ozone concentrations? Our region currently implements more than 90 ozone reduction measures, including vehicle emissions testing, emission controls on major businesses, coordinated traffic signals, clean burning fuels, and many more. However, even with all those measures, our region still does not meet the standard. Federal law requires that we meet the ozone standard by very specific deadlines to avoid being reclassified to a more stringent regulatory category, and those timelines are extremely tight. As noted earlier, our region is currently categorized as moderate, and we have until 2024 to meet the standard or be elevated to the next classification of serious nonattainment. Serious nonattainment will mean a critical change in emission reduction programs and air quality permitting thresholds. If we don't meet the serious area classification deadline by 2027, our region will have to consider even more significant controls. Switching gears from regional ozone reduction measure requirements to air quality permitting, our region is subject to the emission offset requirement. When an area is in non-attainment, a new large source or an existing source that makes a large expansion is required to offset their emissions by more than what they emit. A company can do so by obtaining offsets from the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality Emissions Bank, or attempt to work with a private company to find those offsets. Offsets need to be obtained before an air quality permit can be issued, which is required for a company to begin operating. This table represents the emission thresholds at which point a new or expanding company requires the emission offsets. Today, this permitting program mainly impacts large sources in our region, like power plants or large microchip manufacturers. However, if our area is reclassified to serious, which is very likely, the emission offset requirement will impact most new and expanding industrial businesses, including hot mix asphalt plants, data centers, and coating and painting operations, to name a few. Let's take a real-world example. An area that is classified as serious has an emission offset requirement for any new business that produces more than 50 tons per year. A new microchip manufacturer is currently being permitted at 90 tons per year. However, under a serious area classification, that company would need 108 tons per year of offsets to obtain an air quality permit. The same is true for a new data center that produces 50 tons per year. That facility would need to obtain 60 tons per year of offsets to obtain a permit. So why is this such a significant issue? There are no emission offsets available. Our region is not a heavily industrialized area like Texas or California, so our region does not generate offsets like those states. Therefore, the best emission offset you can get is the one you don't need. This means the faster we can meet the federal ozone standard, the faster our region is relieved of the offset requirement. What are the impacts to businesses of moving from moderate to serious? Today, only very large businesses are impacted. Moving to serious non-attainment will result in impacts to most industrial businesses. Emission offset requirements will escalate. With no emission offsets in the bank, that will affect new business locates and business expansion. So how are we working together to address compliance? First, let's start by looking at the sources of ozone in the region. This graph shows the various ozone sources from a monitor in Phoenix. As you can see, most of the ozone detected at this monitor is boundary condition, or ozone that comes from somewhere else and for which we cannot control locally. This source of ozone is also referred to as transport. We have a smaller set of sources for which we can control and mitigate locally. Those sources include transportation, construction and equipment, and other industry point sources. While the previous example showed a monitor from the urban core, ozone nonattainment is a much larger issue. This is a monitor at Roosevelt Lake that measures ozone levels above the federal standard and is the reason why the nonattainment area extends to the edge of the Tonto National Forest. To decrease ozone levels, our region will need to implement new control measures. However, our continued investment in transportation in this region will significantly help avoid additional regulatory measures. If we are unable to continue investment in our multimodal transportation network, our challenge becomes even more difficult. Implementing agencies will have to find additional and more significant control measures to meet the ozone standard. It just so happens that planned transportation investments and the priorities of the public and our elected officials provide another important benefit. They contribute to achieving ozone attainment. Of note is that among our peers, we have the lowest travel times and levels of congestion and the highest travel time reliability. The extension of Proposition 400 includes investments ranging from 367 new freeway miles to 1,300 miles of new and improved streets to dozens of miles of new transit projects, and much more. Continuing to invest in our world-class transportation system will not only support our booming economy, but these investments also provide important air quality benefits. Not only is ozone bad for our health, but the cost of not meeting the federal standard is very expensive. A study done in Texas but scaled for our region indicates that when we are classified as moderate, as we currently are, it costs the region approximately $100 million each year. The cost doubles if we get reclassified to serious, with annual costs expected to exceed $250 million. The costs continue to double for every classification from there. More recent studies indicate that costs for a region can span anywhere from $200 million to more than $1 billion annually for not attaining the federal ozone standard. Costs include new emission controls on businesses, missed business opportunities for not having offsets for required air quality permitting, and decreases in tax revenues. Businesses may elect to run fewer shifts to lower their emissions for permitting purposes instead of installing expensive ozone reduction equipment. The result? Businesses produce and sell less. As noted earlier, MAG is the planning agency providing information and data to our collective partners, including counties and the state. MAG has a three-tiered strategy to address ozone that builds on decades of Arizona's success in addressing the EPA's air quality standards. First is to develop a plan with effective ozone reduction measures. Second is to determine the level of emissions coming into our area from international sources and develop an international transport demonstration for the EPA. The goal would be to relieve our region from having to implement excessive emission reduction measures due to ozone that originates from outside the U.S. and for which we cannot locally control or mitigate. Finally, is to work with our federal partners to pursue congressional relief for ozone that originates both from international and interstate sources. Further, MAG works with similar regions in the Intermountain West that have the same ozone issues to exchange information on best practices and to raise our issues with a unified voice. To summarize, this issue is important for several key reasons. The region was recently designated moderate nonattainment for ozone and is on a path to being categorized as serious nonattainment. This has implications for public health and economic growth. Continued investment in transportation is critical to work toward ozone attainment, but we need additional emission reduction measures in addition to federal engagement to avoid federal intervention and devastating sanctions.